Eleanor didn't shout. She didn't need to raise her voice to ruin a life. She just needed a microphone and a room full of donors. The crystal chandelier above us caught the light, fracturing it into 1,000 sharp diamonds, mirroring the fracture happening in my chest. "Tonight is about family," she said, her voice smooth as aged bourbon. She placed a manicured hand on my shoulder, the weight of it feeling less like affection and more like an arrest. "And family supports each other through the darkest times. We are heartbroken by the accident involving the pedestrian on Route 9 last week, but we are proud that my daughter-in-law has chosen to step forward, accept full responsibility, and do the right thing to protect the integrity of this community." The room, filled with the city's elite, murmured their approval. They saw a contrite woman being sheltered by a benevolent matriarch. They didn't see the blackmail. They didn't see the ultimatum Eleanor had slid across the mahogany desk an hour ago, take the fall for her youngest son's hit and run. Or the funding for my son's heart surgery vanishes. She held the check for the hospital in her other hand, waving it slightly like a flag of truce that was actually a declaration of war. She had just publicly confessed to a felony on my behalf. I should have screamed. The script called for me to weep, to drop to my knees, to beg David to tell them the truth. The room expected the hysterical mother, broken by guilt. I took a sip of my sparkling water. I kept my spine straight, my chin parallel to the floor. I looked directly into the camera of the local news crew covering the gala. I didn't blink. I didn't nod. I simply let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone but me. Control is not about noise. It is about the absence of reaction when reaction is demanded. I was the fixer. That was my role in the Hoven dynasty. For 10 years. I was the one who balanced the books, the one who sobered them up before board meetings, the one who ensured the charitable foundations passed IRS audits. I was the designated driver, literally and metaphorically. When Lucas, the golden boy, the youngest brother, came home with a smashed grill and blood on the hood of his Porsche, I was the one who called the lawyers. I was the one who told them not to talk. I assumed we were managing a defense. I didn't realize I was being groomed to be the defendant. I had built the very shield they were now using to crush me. The setting was perfect for an execution. The annual Heart Fund Gala. 500 guests in tuxedos and designer gowns, standing in a ballroom that cost more to rent than most people earned in a decade. The centerpiece was a massive projected image of a healthy heart, the very thing my 6-year-old son, Leo, didn't have. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were using the promise of his life to purchase my silence. The Save the Children banner hung above the stage, a grotesque halo over Eleanor's perfectly coiffed gray hair. I looked at David, my husband, the father of the boy whose life was on the auction block. He stood 3 feet to his mother's left. He held a scotch glass so tight his knuckles were white. David knew who was driving that night. He had been on the phone with Lucas 10 minutes after the impact. He had cried in our bedroom, swearing we would fix this, now. He studied the pattern on the Persian rug. He didn't look at me. He took a step closer to Eleanor. A subtle, physical shift of allegiance. He chose the inheritance. He chose the path of least resistance. In that small shuffle of his dress shoes, he severed 10 years of marriage. The blood rushed in my ears. A high-pitched whine like a dentist's drill. My vision tunneled for a second, the edges of the room blurring into a wash of gold and black. My fingertips were numb, cold against the condensation on the glass. I felt the physical sickness of betrayal, a heavy stone dropping into my stomach. But my hand didn't shake. I set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray without a rattle. Eleanor thought she was playing chess. She thought she had checkmated me with Leo's surgery. She assumed I was just the mother, just the wife, just the outsider who married in. She forgot I was the CFO of their shell companies before I stepped down to care for Leo. She forgot I knew how the telemetry data on the company cars worked. I reached into my clutch. I wasn't reaching for a tissue. I touched the cold metal of my phone. I had suspected. You don't live with vipers for a decade without learning to watch the grass. 2 days ago, before the police seized the vehicle, I had remotely downloaded the cloud backup from the Porsche's onboard computer, GPS data, speed logs, weight sensors on the driver's seat, and the cabin audio recording from the moment of impact. It was all encrypted on a server they didn't have the passwords for. With a single swipe of my thumb, I disabled the auto-delete protocol I had set up as a failsafe. I forwarded the encryption key to a dead-drop email address only I could access. I looked back at Eleanor. She was smiling at the applause, basking in the glow of her own benevolence. She thought she had just bought a scapegoat. I watched David raise his glass to the toast. They looked at me and saw a woman defeated by the weight of her child's need. I looked at them and saw a case study in evidence collection. This wasn't the end of my life. It was the opening statement. The warning signs didn't scream. They whispered. I should have heard them over the din of my own busy life. But I was too focused on keeping the Hoven machinery oiled to notice the gears were grinding toward me. 3 months ago, Eleanor abruptly removed my signature authority from the family charitable trust. She called it a liability restructuring advised by the board. I accepted it. It made sense on paper. 2 weeks later, David stopped wearing his wedding ring at the country club. He claimed it was chafing, that his fingers were swelling from the humidity. I bought him a silicone band for golf. He never wore that either. Then came the silence from the estate attorney. Arthur, who used to call me for clarification on tax loopholes every Tuesday, suddenly stopped returning my emails regarding the quarterly projections. I didn't make a scene. I didn't confront David over a cold dinner or demand answers from Eleanor during Sunday brunch. I did what I do best. I audited. I treated my marriage like a failing subsidiary I had been brought in to salvage. I waited until David was asleep, the scotch heavy on his breath, and I accessed the shared cloud. I didn't look for love letters or hotel receipts. Those are distractions. I looked for the money. I cross-referenced the family ledger with the private schedules. I tracked a sudden, massive liquidation of assets from the joint portfolio. My portfolio transferred into a high-risk, offshore holding company registered in the Caymans. The beneficiary wasn't listed, but the transfer date coincided perfectly with Lucas's impromptu trip to the Caribbean. They weren't just hiding money, they were defunding me. They were stripping the copper wire out of the walls before burning the house down. The chief legal officer, a man whose career I had saved twice, was CC'd on a chain of emails discussing Scenario B. The subject line was blank. The content was encrypted. But the metadata showed the attachments were drafted 48 hours after Lucas had returned with the damaged Porsche. They knew. They knew for weeks. And in those weeks, they hadn't been looking for a way to help me. They had been building the cage. They forgot who I was. They saw a mother desperate for her son's survival, a woman who would sign anything to keep the heart monitor beeping. They forgot that before I was Leo's mother, I was the youngest CFO in the history of the firm. My currency isn't emotion, it is leverage. It is the ability to look at a chaotic spread of data and find the single row that doesn't reconcile. I function on verification. I believe in audit trails, not promises. While they were busy drafting the NDA and rehearsing their speeches about family sacrifice, I was busy documenting the architecture of their fraud. I knew they would view my silence as weakness. They mistake quiet for compliance. In my world, quiet is just the sound of data being compiled. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I needed to make sure that when I finally spoke, the evidence would be irrefutable. I began to construct my defense, not with tears, but with redundancies. I built a firewall they couldn't touch, a fortress of information designed to withstand a siege. The Porsche 911 is a computer on wheels. It records speed, braking force, seatbelt tension, and cabin audio. They had the physical car, but I had the login. I pulled the raw data logs the night Lucas came home shaking. I didn't just save them to my laptop. That would be amateur. I uploaded the encrypted files to a remote server located in a jurisdiction with strict data privacy laws, paid for with a prepaid debit card bought with cash at a gas station 3 towns over. I downloaded 5 years of tax returns, the unsanitized versions, the ones that showed the creative accounting Eleanor used to fund her political donations. I printed them out. Hard copies. Digital files can be wiped, paper has to be burned. I placed these documents in a safety deposit box at a bank the Vanderhovens didn't own shares in, registered under my maiden name. I mailed the key to a P.O. box I had rented a year ago for a consulting gig I never told David about. I wrote it myself, a clear, unemotional chronology of events, the time Lucas called David, the time David left the house, the time he returned, smelling of bleach and fear. I detailed the conversation where Eleanor explicitly stated that the family name was worth more than the truth. I didn't file it. I didn't show it to anyone. I simply had it notarized by a clerk in a strip mall who didn't know who I was, and I placed it in a sealed envelope marked, "In the event of my legal incapacitation," with a lawyer who had sued the Vanderhovens twice and lost. He was hungry. He would know what to do. But the most critical layer was Leo. They were counting on Leo. They knew his heart condition was the leash that kept me heel. They believed that if they threatened to cut the funding for his transplant, I would take the fall for murder to save him. It was a brutal, effective calculation. It was also a miscalculation. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. I liquidated everything I could touch without triggering an alert. My 401k, the bonds my grandmother left me, the diamond earrings David gave me for our 5th anniversary. I sold them to a private jeweler for 60 cents on the dollar. It wasn't enough for the whole surgery, but it was enough for the deposit and the first month of ICU care. I took that cash and opened an irrevocable trust. I named a professional fiduciary a stranger, a cold, by-the-book administrator as the trustee. The mandate was simple. The funds were to be used exclusively for the medical care of Leo Vanderhoven. The trust was blind. It didn't care who Leo's mother was. It didn't care if I was in prison or in Paris. It couldn't be frozen by a lawsuit against me. It couldn't be revoked by Eleanor. I severed the leash. I ensured that no matter what happened to me, no matter how hard they squeezed, my son would get his heart. I took away their power to kill him, to control me. I did this while making David his morning coffee. I did this while nodding politely at Eleanor's lectures on loyalty. I secured the innocent, so I would be free to destroy the guilty. Which brings us back to the ballroom. The applause was dying down. Eleanor was beaming, her hand still heavy on my shoulder, waiting for me to play the part of the martyr. David was staring at the floor, studying the intricate weave of the carpet as if the pattern contained his absolution. I didn't pull away. I didn't cry. I simply opened my clutch and touched the screen of my phone. I didn't send the data to the police. Not yet. The police are a blunt instrument, and I needed a scalpel. I sent a text message to Arthur, the family attorney sitting at table 4. It contained a single link and a 6-character password. The link led to a 10-second audio clip hosted on my secure server. It wasn't the crash. It was the moment immediately after. It was the sound of the Porsche's cabin, the heavy breathing, and Lucas's voice, clear and unmistakable, slurring slightly. "Oh God, I hit him. David, you have to help me. Mom will kill me. I'm drunk. David, I'm so drunk." I watched Arthur. He felt the vibration. He pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket, annoyed at the interruption. He glanced at the screen. He tapped the link. He held the phone to his ear, trying to be discreet. I saw the color drain from his face. It was instantaneous. The blood left his cheeks, leaving him looking like a wax figure. He stopped breathing. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room until they locked onto mine. I held his gaze. I didn't smile. I barely blinked. I raised my eyebrows just a fraction of an inch. I have it, the look said. I have it all. He looked at Eleanor, then back at me. He slowly placed the phone face down on the table, his hand trembling slightly. He understood. This wasn't a bluff. This was a receipt. Eleanor squeezed my shoulder, a prompt for me to speak, to accept the shame she had gift-wrapped for me. She still thought she was the player moving the pieces. She thought she had trapped a rabbit. She didn't realize she had just locked herself in a cage with a cobra. From her perspective, I was a daughter-in-law being brought to heel. From mine, I was a whistleblower who had just finished the documentation phase. I had stripped myself of the need for their approval. I had stripped myself of the need to protect their image. The woman who would have covered for them died the moment they threatened my son. The narrative was no longer theirs to write. It belonged to the timestamps. It belonged to the IP addresses. It belonged to the structure I had built in the dark while they were busy admiring their own reflection. The notification came at 7:05 a.m. It wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a banging on the door. It was a standard automated alert from the secure document portal used by Arthur's law firm. Status Update File 892B Settlement Agreement, NDA, Suspended, Reason Compliance Review. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Arthur. Not the Arthur who drank single malt scotch with my father-in-law, and not the Arthur who had tried to gently coerce me into signing a felony confession the night before. This was Arthur, the managing partner, the man who had suddenly realized his license to practice law was dangling by a thread of dental floss. "We have a problem with the execution of the documents," he said. His voice was tight, stripped of all the fake warmth he usually layered on. He didn't say hello. "We received supplementary material last night. It creates a conflict with the narrative presented in the affidavit you were scheduled to sign." "I didn't send an affidavit." "Arthur," I said, pouring myself a cup of black coffee. My hand was steady. The steam rose in a perfect, calm column. I sent a clarification of facts. "The board of the firm has been notified," he continued, talking over me, panic bleeding into his professional cadence. "We cannot proceed with the trust transfer or the medical funding until the discrepancy regarding the driver's identity is resolved. The funds are frozen, Eleanor's accounts included, pending an internal ethics audit. You need to come in, now." He hung up. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask about Leo. He was a rat who had just smelled smoke in the walls of his own ship. The system had engaged. The gears of liability, once greased by Hoven money, had just ground to a halt because I threw a wrench made of digital truth into the machinery. I put the phone down. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't scrambling to fix the problem. I had created the problem, and I was going to let it sit there and rot. Eleanor arrived at my house 40 minutes later. She didn't ring the bell. She used the emergency key she kept for emergencies, storming into the foyer with the entitlement of a queen entering a colony in revolt. David trailed behind her, looking pale and hungover, wearing yesterday's suit. "What did you do?" Eleanor didn't shout. She hissed. It was a low, dangerous sound. She threw her alligator skin bag onto the console table, knocking over a vase of dried reeds. "Arthur says the accounts are locked. He says the firm is conducting a due diligence review because of an anonymous tip. You sent something." "It wasn't anonymous," I said. I stood by the kitchen island, creating a physical barrier between us. "And I didn't send a tip, I sent evidence." David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "You have to retract it," he said, his voice cracking. He sounded like a child asking for a do-over. "You have to tell them it was a deep fake or a recording from a movie. Mom says if we don't fix this by noon, the SEC gets involved because of the liquidity freeze." My stock options. The merger, it all stops. Retract the truth, I asked. Looking at him, I felt a strange hollowness where my love for him used to be. It wasn't anger anymore. It was just disappointment, cold and hard as marble. I can't retract a GPS log. David, I can't retract the timestamps on the airbag deployment sensors. You are destroying this family. Eleanor stepped forward, her finger pointing at my chest like a weapon. We gave you everything. We took you in. We are paying for your son's heart. You were paying for my son's heart, I corrected her. Past tense. You used his heart as a bargaining chip. That transaction is closed. I will crush you, she whispered, leaning over the counter. I will bury you in litigation so deep you won't see the sun for 20 years. You think one audio clip scares me? I have judges in my contact list who owe me their careers. Call them, I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the tremor she was looking for. Call them and ask them if they want to obstruct a federal investigation involving a hit and run that left a man in a coma. Because that's not a traffic violation. Eleanor, that's a felony. And now that Arthur has the file, he has a legal duty to report it, or he goes to prison too. You aren't negotiating with me anymore. You're negotiating with the American Bar Association. She stared at me for a second. The mask slipped. I saw genuine fear behind her eyes. She realized I wasn't playing the emotional game. I had moved the board. I wasn't asking for an apology. I was citing the rules of engagement. I knew exactly what I was doing. This wasn't an impulse. It was a structural shift. In the Hoven world, problems were solved in living rooms, over brandy, with promises and threats. That was their arena. They won there because they had the money and the history. I couldn't win there. So I moved the conflict. I dragged it out of the living room and into the fluorescent-lit, air-conditioned, merciless world of compliance officers and risk management assessment. By triggering Arthur's liability, I forced the system to protect itself. Arthur didn't care about me, but he cared about his firm. He would throw Eleanor under the bus to save his partnership. I hadn't just attacked them, I had weaponized their own lawyers against them. I wasn't counting on luck, I was counting on the cowardice of institutions. At 2:00 p.m., we convened in the conference room of a neutral law firm downtown. This was not Arthur's plush office with the mahogany paneling. This was a conflict counsel office, glass walls, gray carpet, silence that felt like a vacuum. The room was presided over by a woman named Ms. Sterling. She was a senior compliance auditor. She wore a navy suit and glasses that magnified her eyes, making her look like an owl scanning for prey. She didn't care about the Hoven name. To her, we were just a high-risk file. On one side of the table sat Eleanor, David, and a very sweaty Arthur. On the other side sat me and the notebook I had brought. Between us lay a single flash drive. We have reviewed the submission, Ms. Sterling said. Her voice was dry, precise. She didn't look at anyone. She looked at the file. The metadata on the audio recording matches the vehicle telematics from the night of the incident. The voice print analysis preliminary, of course, is a 99% match for Mr. Lucas Hoven. Lucas, who had been dragged here by his mother, slumped in his chair. He looked like a ghost. He was shaking. This is inadmissible, Eleanor said, her voice tight. It was obtained without consent. Actually, Ms. Sterling said, cutting her off without looking up. Mrs. Hoven was the registered administrator of the vehicle's maintenance account. She had consent to access all data logs. It is fully admissible. She paused, then looked directly at Arthur. Arthur, your firm represented that the driver was the wife. You drafted a settlement based on that fact. If this audio is authentic, your firm has facilitated the subornation of perjury. We are recommending that your firm recuse itself immediately. Arthur didn't fight. He nodded. He looked at Eleanor and said, I can't sign the checks. Eleanor, I can't touch the money. If I move a cent now, it's money laundering. The cut was clean, it was deep. The settlement offer regarding the medical trust is void. Ms. Sterling continued. She made a note on her pad. The sound of her pen scratching the paper was the loudest thing in the room. We are obligated to turn these findings over to the district attorney's office within 24 hours, unless a counterfiling proving the data is falsified is presented. Do you have such proof? Silence. Lucas put his head in his hands. David looked at me, pleading with his eyes. I looked at the whiteboard behind Ms. Sterling. No, Arthur whispered. Then the timeline stands. Ms. Sterling said, the file goes to the DA tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. I walked out of the building alone. The air outside was hot, humid, the kind of city heat that sticks to your skin. I took a breath. It tasted like exhaust fumes and freedom. I ran into Julian, a member of the hospital board and a longtime golf buddy of David's father. He was coming out of the Starbucks in the lobby, usually. Julian would kiss me on the cheek and ask about the charity gala. Today, he stopped. He looked at me, then looked at the elevator bank where the Hovens were likely still screaming at their lawyers. I heard the accounts were frozen. Julian said. He didn't smile. He adjusted his tie. There's a rumor that the insurance adjusters are asking for the driving logs. The real ones. Is that so? I asked. You know, he said, looking me in the eye, his voice dropping a register. Lucas never did know when to stop. People tolerate a lot. But messy paperwork makes people nervous. If the DA is looking, the board can't be associated with the family. Not right now. I understand, Julian, I said. Good luck, kid, he said. He didn't say fix it. He didn't say stand by your man. He walked away. It was a small moment, but it was the crack in the dam. The social shield was fracturing. They weren't the untouchable dynasty anymore. They were a liability. The rats were checking the lifeboats. I sat on a bench in the plaza and checked my phone. I had access to the shared family calendar. David hadn't thought to revoke it yet. The entries were changing before my eyes. Meeting with Senator canceled. Dinner with the underwriters postponed. Lucas flight to Aspen error. Booking failed. They were sliding. The friction of the system was catching them. Every credit card swipe, every flight booking, every transfer was now hitting a review flag. They were drowning in the red tape they usually paid people like me to cut through. I watched a pigeon peck at a crumb on the pavement. I felt a vibration in my pocket. A text from David. David, we can still fix this. Just come back to the office. Mom is willing to renegotiate the trust. Please, we need you. I looked at the message. I remembered the way he looked at the floor while his mother sold me out. I remembered the silicone ring he wouldn't wear. I didn't reply. I opened the settings and turned off read receipts. I used to be the one who smoothed the edges. I used to be the cushion between them and the hard reality of the world. I absorbed the shock so they could ride in comfort. I stood up and hailed a cab. I wasn't the cushion anymore. I was the concrete. The clock, the signatures, and the subpoenas would handle the rest. The collapse of the Hoven influence didn't happen with a bang. It happened with the quiet, administrative sound of doors closing, one by one. The first door was the senator's. For 20 years. Eleanor had been a platinum donor, the kind of supporter who got a private audience before the primary, 2 weeks after the compliance review notification. The senator's campaign manager returned a check for $50,000. It came with a form letter. Due to updated ethics guidelines regarding donors under active investigation, we must respectfully decline. Eleanor had framed the rejection letter. Or rather, she had left it on the hallway table, staring at it as if it were a foreign language she couldn't translate. Then came the charity boards, the Heart Fund, the Art Museum, the Botanical Gardens. These were Eleanor's fiefdoms. She ruled them with a checkbook and a raised eyebrow. But boards are composed of risk-averse people. When the rumors of a district attorney inquiry started circulating rumors, fueled by the sudden recusal of Arthur's law firm, the boards held emergency meetings. They didn't fire her. That would be too crude. They voted to rotate leadership for a fresh perspective. They sent her flower arrangements thanking her for her decades of service, effectively retiring her into irrelevance. David wasn't spared. The merger he had been banking on, the one that was supposed to legitimize his tenure as CEO, stalled. The acquiring firm didn't cite the hit and run. They cited instability in the executive leadership structure. They requested a hold on due diligence. In corporate speak, that is a death sentence. It means they smell a corpse and don't want to be in the room when it starts to rot. I watched all of this from a distance. I didn't have to lift a finger. I had simply turned on the lights in a room they preferred to keep dark, and the roaches were scattering. My new life was smaller, but it was mine. I rented a 2-bedroom condo in the city, 20 minutes from the hospital where Leo was now prepped for surgery. The walls were white. The furniture was functional. There were no Persian rugs to worry about staining. No crystal vases that cost more than a car. I went back to work, not as a CFO for a shell company, but as a forensic auditor for a mid-sized consulting firm. My job was to look at other people's messes and find the truth buried in the spreadsheets. I was good at it. I had been trained by the masters of obfuscation, so I knew exactly where to look for the bodies. I billed by the hour. I clocked in at 8. I clocked out at 6. I paid my own rent with money I earned, not money I was given as an allowance. There is a specific kind of dignity in paying a utility bill with a check that has only your name on it. The fatigue was there. The stress of Leo's condition was a constant low-frequency hum in the back of my mind. But the fear was gone. I wasn't walking on eggshells anymore. I was walking on concrete. It was hard, unforgiving, and solid. I didn't answer David's calls. He called late at night, usually after 2 a.m. The voicemails were a mix of anger and pathetic nostalgia. He missed the way I organized his schedule. He missed the way I handled his mother. He didn't miss me. He missed the service I provided. The social circles began to realign. The people who used to look through me at parties suddenly found my phone number. Caroline, a woman who had once made a joke about my entry-level background at her husband's yacht party, called me on a Tuesday morning. "Darling," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't ask how I was. She skipped the pleasantries. "I heard about the data dump, the logs." "Yes, Caroline," I asked, typing a report while I held the phone to my ear. "My husband, he was with Lucas that night, before the accident. At the club." She paused, the silence heavy with anxiety. Is his name in the files you have? Because if there's a subpoena, we need to know, for the children's sake." "The children," I repeated. It was always the shield. "The files contain facts, Caroline, timestamps, GPS locations, passenger weight sensors. If your husband was in the car knows I don't control the car." "But you could redact it for old time's sake." "I don't redact, Caroline," I said, my voice even. "I audit. If he was there, he was there. I suggest he hire his own lawyer, a good one, not Arthur." I hung up. I didn't feel a thrill of power. I felt a profound sense of clarity. These people weren't my friends. They were barnacles attached to the hull of the Hoven ship. And now that the ship was sinking, they were terrified of the water. The formal severance came 4 weeks later. It wasn't a divorce hearing yet. The courts moved too slow for that. It was a relentless, mandatory mediation session regarding the separation of immediate liquid assets and the interim custody arrangement for Leo. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Omni Center. Neutral ground. The table was oval, designed to encourage cooperation. The air conditioning was set to 68 degrees. David sat across from me. He looked 10 years older. His suit fit poorly. as if he had lost weight too quickly. Eleanor wasn't there. Her lawyers had advised her that her presence was inflammatory, given the pending DA investigation. Instead of Eleanor, David was flanked by a junior associate from a firm I didn't recognize. They were scraping the bottom of the barrel. On my side of the table sat Mr. Henderson, the court-appointed financial neutral. He was a man of numbers, gray-haired, meticulous, and utterly unimpressed by the Hoven legacy. "We are here to establish the baseline for support," the junior associate began, puffing out his chest. "Mr. Hoven is willing to offer a generous monthly stipend, provided that Mrs. Hoven signs a non-disparagement agreement regarding the current legal misunderstandings." He slid a paper across the table. It was the same old play. Money for silence. I didn't touch the paper. I looked at Mr. Henderson. "Mr. Henderson," I said, "could you please display Exhibit C from the forensic analysis of the joint marital accounts?" Mr. Henderson nodded. He tapped his tablet, and the large screen on the wall flickered to life. A spreadsheet appeared. It showed a complex series of transfers dated 3 days after the accident. "This," Mr. Henderson said, using a laser pointer, "shows a withdrawal of $200,000 from the joint savings account community property. It was routed through a shell entity and paid to a consultant known for reputation management. Specifically, a firm that specializes in scrubbing online search results and other services." David flinched. He knew what that money was. It was the bribe for the witness who didn't see anything. "Using marital funds to facilitate a potential obstruction of justice is a significant issue," Mr. Henderson said, his voice dry. "It exposes the marital estate to civil forfeiture. Furthermore, since Mrs. Hoven did not consent to this expenditure, it is considered dissipation of assets." "That was a business expense," David stammered. "For the firm." "The firm didn't hit a pedestrian, David," I said. The room went quiet. "The court will likely view this as theft from the spouse to cover a criminal act," Mr. Henderson continued. "Therefore, the preliminary recommendation is that Mrs. Hoven retains 100% of the remaining liquid assets in the joint accounts to offset the dissipation. Additionally, the non-disparagement agreement is rejected as unconscionable given the ongoing criminal investigation." David stared at the screen. The numbers were right there. He couldn't charm them. He couldn't threaten them. "You're taking everything," David whispered. "The house, the accounts. You're leaving me with nothing." "I'm leaving you with your choices," I said. "You spent our money to cover your brother's crime. You spent my son's heart surgery money to buy silence. The math is simply correcting the error." The junior associate looked at David, then closed his folder. He knew when he was beat. He realized he wasn't there to win. He was there to minimize the bleeding. "We will take this under advisement," the associate said, his voice small. "You do that," I said. As we left the room, the elevator ride was silent. I stood near the buttons. David stood in the back corner. When the doors opened to the lobby, a man was waiting. It was the Hoven family's longtime accountant, a man named Marcus. He wasn't there for the meeting. He was there to intercept David. Marcus looked tired. He held a briefcase that looked heavy. "David," Marcus said, nodding to me but addressing my husband, "I need you to sign the release forms. The bank is calling the loan on the summer house. They saw the news about the investigation. They're activating the morality clause in the mortgage." David looked at Marcus, then at me. He looked like a child who had lost his mother in a supermarket. "Can't you fix it, Marcus?" David asked. "Can't we just move some funds?" "There are no funds to move, David," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the lobby chatter. "And I'm not going to jail for you. Sign the release." It was a mini payoff, delivered not by me, but by a man who had served them for 30 years. The loyal foot soldier was putting down his weapon. I watched David take the pen. His hand shook. He signed his name, surrendering a property that had been in his family for 3 generations. He looked at me one last time. "I did it for the family," he said, a weak justification. "I know," I said. "That's why you lost." I walked out the revolving doors. The city noise rushed in horns, sirens, people shouting. It was chaotic, but it was real. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. I checked my watch. I had to pick up a prescription for Leo, and then I had a meeting with a client who needed help tracing a fraudulent vendor. I wasn't the peacekeeper anymore. I wasn't the buffer. I was just a woman who understood how the system worked. And for the first time, I was letting the system work exactly as it was designed. I didn't look back at the glass building. The divorce was just paperwork now. The real separation had happened the moment I realized I could survive without their protection. The dust didn't settle, it hardened. That is the nature of legal concrete. Once the wet, chaotic mess of accusations and panic dries under the heat of a federal inquiry, it becomes a structure that you cannot talk your way out of. 6 months after the gala. The mail arrived at my new address. It wasn't a handwritten apology or a desperate plea. It was a certified copy of the final plea agreement, forwarded by the district attorney's office as a courtesy to the primary witness. I sat at my kitchen table, the morning sun hitting the clean, white laminate. I opened the envelope with a letter opener, slitting the top with a single precise motion. The document was 20 pages long, the people versus Lucas van der Hoven, but the real weight was in the addendums. Lucas had accepted a plea for vehicular assault and DUI, 3 years in a state facility, mandatory rehabilitation. But the paragraph that mattered, the one that felt like a physical weight being lifted off my chest, was on page 12. It detailed the accessory after-the-fact charges against Eleanor van der Hoven. She had avoided prison time. Her lawyers had successfully argued her age and health, but the system had extracted a different price. The defendant, Eleanor van der Hoven, is hereby permanently barred from serving as a director, officer, or trustee of any 501c3 charitable organization or financial institution within the jurisdiction. It was a bureaucratic sentence, dry and boring to the untrained eye. But to Eleanor, it was a lobotomy. Her power didn't come from her money. It came from her influence, her seat at the head of the table. The court hadn't just fined her, they had erased her identity. She was now just a wealthy, elderly woman with an ankle monitor and a list of places she wasn't allowed to go. There was a separate notification regarding David. He wasn't charged criminally. He had been smart enough, or cowardly enough, to stay off the phone lines during the cover-up, but the civil fallout had stripped him clean. The bank had exercised its right to offset the defaulted loans against his personal accounts. The van der Hoven family trust was now under court-appointed receivership. He couldn't sign a check for more than $500 without a counter-signature from a bankruptcy trustee. I put the document down. I didn't feel a surge of joy. I didn't feel the need to pop champagne. I felt the satisfaction of a ledger finally balancing to zero. My life had become a series of quiet, manageable victories. Leo's transplant had been successful. The recovery was slow, demanding, and expensive, but the independent trust I had established was functioning perfectly. The fiduciary paid the hospital bills directly. There were no family meetings to approve the funds. There was no begging. I worked 45 hours a week. I had been promoted to senior auditor. My office was small, efficient, and mine. I had a succulent on the windowsill that I watered every Friday. I had stopped being the fixer for everyone else. I no longer anticipated needs. I no longer carried the emotional luggage of grown men. If the printer at work broke, I called it. If my landlord didn't fix the sink, I sent a certified letter citing the tenant code. I used the system to protect my peace, not to hide someone else's war. I saw David once, from a distance. It was outside the courthouse during a procedural hearing I didn't need to attend. He was arguing with a parking attendant, He looked disheveled, his gestures frantic. He was trying to use his name to get out of a $20 fee. The attendant just pointed to the sign, "Cash or credit only." David looked around, helpless. He didn't have the tool set to function in a world that didn't bend to him. I watched him for a moment. Then I rolled up my window and drove away. I didn't feel the urge to help. That instinct had been surgically removed. The social narrative had finally caught up with the legal one. I ran into Beatrice, the former chair of the Botanical Gardens Board, while waiting for a prescription at CVS. In the old days, Beatrice would have looked through me, or offered a pitying smile about poor Lucas's accident. She stood in the aisle, holding a bottle of vitamins. She looked at me, then glanced around to see if anyone was watching. "I saw the report in the Times," she said. Her voice was low, stripped of the social affectation. Obstruction of justice, that's what they called it. "That's what it was, Beatrice," I said, checking the label on my bottle. "We all thought—" She trailed off, shifting her weight. "We all thought it was just a family matter. That's how Eleanor spun it. A misunderstanding. But reading the allocution, forcing you to take the fall, it's monstrous." "It was criminal," I corrected her gently. "Monstrous is an opinion. Criminal is a fact." "Yes," she said, nodding slowly. "Criminal. You were right to leave. We should have asked more questions." She didn't apologize for her silence back then. People like Beatrice rarely do. But she had crossed a line. She had stopped using the family's euphemisms. She called the behavior by its legal name. That was enough. The following week, I was training a new hire at the firm. Sarah. She was 22, bright-eyed, eager to please. She reminded me of myself 10 years ago, capable, but too willing to be helpful. We were reviewing a client's request. The client, a charismatic CEO, wanted us to adjust the date on a revenue recognition document to help him meet a quarterly target. He had sent Sarah a charming email, saying it was a minor clerical error and implying that fixing it would be a great favor to him personally. Sarah had the mouse cursor hovering over the edit button. "He's really stressed," Sarah said, "and it's just 1 day difference. It seems mean to say no." I reached over and placed my hand on her wrist, gentle but firm. "Stop," I said. She looked at me, startled. "Sarah, look at the signature line," I said, pointing to the screen. "If you change that date, whose digital fingerprint is on the modification?" "Mine," she whispered. "Exactly," I said. "He gets the bonus, you get the fraud charge." "But he said he'd take care of it." "There is no taking care of it in forensic auditing," I told her, looking her dead in the eye. "There is only the document. Never set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. If he made a mistake, let him own the error. Your signature is your life. Don't give it away for a compliment." She pulled her hand back. She clicked reject. I watched her type the email. "Per compliance protocols, we cannot alter the record." It was a small moment, but in that moment, I saw the chain break. I hadn't just saved myself, I had taught someone else how to build a shield. I walked home that evening. The city was cool, the air crisp. I stopped at the park where Leo liked to watch the ducks. I sat on the bench and thought about the Hovens. They were still trapped in their cycle of blame, spending their dwindling fortune on lawyers, trying to rewrite a story that was already printed in black ink. They were prisoners of their own refusal to accept reality. I looked at my hands. They were empty. They weren't holding a secret. They weren't holding a bribe. They weren't holding a family together. I had taken the most powerful weapon they had, their ability to define the truth, and I had dismantled it, piece by piece, using their own rules. Revenge wasn't about burning their house down. It was about stepping out of the burning house, locking the door, and handing the keys to the fire marshal. I closed my eyes and took a breath. The best revenge is simply living a life that they can no longer edit.